And so many of us get really creative. I'm not trying to be rude or mean, but we get creative and clever with our podcast title. But you wonder why people aren't finding your podcast, because nobody knows what the podcast show about everything is, right? Like no one knows what that is. So you want to make it very clear, even in your show title. And you can change your podcast title whenever you want. It doesn't mess anything up. You can do it at any point. There's nothing to it. You literally go to your hosting provider, change it, enter, save, done. Don't like it, go back and change it a week later, right? You can do whatever you want. But the thing is, you want to make sure that your show title describes what your podcast is about, so that when somebody's searching for it, one, it comes up, but two, it quantifies the fact that, yep, that's what I just said I was looking for, and there it is, right? And then the other thing is your description. Let your description reinforce the title. Put the keywords in there again. Make sure that people know if they're going to even read it, keep it brief, or at least keep the top of it brief. You can add more below it, but above the fold, you want people to basically say, confirmed, this is what I'm looking for, right? The next thing is your actual episode titles. A lot of something I still see people commonly do is they say season 1, episode 4, and they spell it out, right? And then they put the guest name or something like that. That doesn't tell me anything. I'm trying to figure out how to eat healthy over Christmas so I don't put on 10 pounds, right? And if it says season 4, episode 5 with Alex Sanfilippo, that doesn't tell me that you're going to help me keep weight off during the holidays, right? That doesn't tell me that. But if it says how to make sure you don't put on weight during the holidays, that's exactly what I'm searching for and looking for, right? So you want to build things that have the exact words that people are searching for. So you want that to be in the episode titles and the episode descriptions. Again, the description helps it rank because you can use the keyword, but also reinforces it. So if I'm somebody who's like looking at it, I'm like, I might click the description and I'll read the first couple sentences. That's all I'm going to read. I'm not going to read all of it. Read the first couple sentences and be like, yeah, it's exactly what I'm describing. Listen, right? I'm going to hear that out. This right here, along with finding one new listener every day, is the greatest way to grow your podcast.
Oh, I love it. You said you don't come on too strong. Carol Cox told me years ago that the reason she loved our pitches is because we always give the host an out. So contrary to typical sales coaching, where you want to use like really closing words, we use words like, we have a client who might be a good fit as a guest on your show. Like, we always give the host an out because we recognize it's their decision to make on whether or not this topic and guest is a fit for them, that they know their podcast more intimately than we do. So that's first of all around the language. The pitch for us, it's far more important, the topic that we are pitching, than anything that we are including about the guest. And that's where we kind of blur the line into, we're almost like content creators and content strategists, really figuring out, well, what's the topic that's going to resonate with this host's audience that also highlights me, my business, and my expertise. So if you can come up with a really compelling topic, then you just sprinkle in a couple of like credibility markers, like, oh, I have a podcast, or I've been in business this number of years, if you've won an award. But really, that part of it should take maybe 2 sentences. The whole pitch is really not about you as the person. It's about what you can bring to that show. And we will put our new, this has been a couple years we've done it, we'll put their full bio, but at the very end. So basically, after we sign off, we're like, okay, here's more info if you want it. But we didn't want to fill the pitch with that.
So we are a video content marketing agency. Our entire goal is to help you shorten your sales cycle using video, okay? Now, what am I talking about here? What I'm talking about is the fact that your ideal customer is trying to build a relationship with you before they ever actually come see you, before you even know they exist. They want to feel like they're in a relationship with you, okay? Now, we've all heard this before, and we call it know, like, and trust. Yes, they want to build know, like, and trust. Guess what? That's building relationship. Right? How do you build relationship with someone? You go through things with them. You ask them questions. And your ideal customer is doing the exact same thing with you. They're going to Google and asking questions and hoping that they get an answer. Well, guess what? If you answer it, then you have any opportunity to build relationships. So that's what we help you do. We help you find those questions that your ideal customer is asking, and then answer them and position them on Google search so that you can be found by your ideal customer. They can build a relationship. And let me tell you what happens. Okay. So for example, we had a doctor who said, oh my gosh, I just made the easiest $26,000 sale I've ever made. because people come in and they feel like they know you, they feel like they love you, they trust you, and they're ready to go. And that's the beauty.
So I've noticed the blog posts that have no YouTube videos versus the one that do have YouTube videos, there's a difference. The one that does have these videos typically performs better. And those episodes typically have more plays because people, it's now in a different place, right? It's more visible out there. So even if you don't produce videos, I do not produce videos. I still take that audio video and I put it in my show notes to have that SEO Google juice. So you could still leverage and use that. Imagine if you don't have that capability with your hosting platform. You can still look for within YouTube a related video. Maybe your guest has a YouTube channel. Take that video and put it into your show notes. When you have your own SEO checklist, your show notes checklist, YouTube videos are always on mine. So I'm either looking for a video I can put on that it's mine or a guest or something related that I think is relevant. Because again, I just want to benefit from having YouTube's product on my page and for Google to be like, oh, that's cool. Awesome.
That's one of the things that I always tell people when they say, what should you do to be a good podcast guest? I'm like, forget the word podcast. What should you do to be a good guest, right? Megan, if you invite me over for dinner, right? And I would know beforehand, is this a barbecue? Is this a formal thing, right? I would show up on time, right? Mm-hmm. I would reach out the day before and say, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to this, right? So it's not 5 minutes before the event and you're wondering, are they going to show up? And when I'm there, I'm going to be the gracious guest, right? I'm going to thank you. I'm going to acknowledge the audience, right? It's not about me. It's about the audience and the value they can bring there. And if you do that from the beginning, man, people want to help you, right? And that's one of those great things in podcasting too. If you do a good job, you don't have to look for 1,000 interviews to email, right? If you do a good job, podcasters know podcasters. And at the end, they'll say, oh, you would be great for this show and this show. Can I introduce you? And boom, your dance card gets full quick that way.
This was actually one of the first podcasts we ever produced as Frequency Media, and it was with Coca-Cola. And they wanted to create an internal podcast for their employees. And they came to us, and I have experience in internal communications. My whole career is in branding internally and externally for big brands. And they came to us and I was like, I know exactly what you're trying to achieve with this internal comms thing. They wanted it to be a private podcast, not available externally. And I was like, if you are being authentic and genuine, and we are watching out for any kind of trade secrets, which they wouldn't put out in their podcast anyway, why not make it external? Let's make it external. That shows your employees that you mean and are ready to be accountable to what you're saying on this podcast. And also allow us to unmedia train all of your executive leaders in North America, which is a big ask. So I was able to get them to that point because I was like, this is your podcast. We're not going to put anything in here that you're not comfortable with, but we need people to be authentic and genuine, these leaders. And we created this podcast. They did a pulse survey, so an employee engagement survey before the podcast and after the podcast. The podcast alone, 7 episodes, helped to raise employee trust and leadership by 30 points. 30 points. We ended up winning best podcast at Reagan Communications, which is an internal and employee communications organization. And it was because we really coveted both the brand promise and what we were hoping, what kind of impact we were hoping to have on these employees, which was a very genuine, authentic look at the company's future vision for success. And also at what leadership actually looks like at a company that had previously held itself to such a perfectionist standard that there was almost this robotic view of leaders. We broke that down for them on a podcast. So all that to say, a podcast is not just a podcast. It is a forum. It is a dialogue. And you want to treat it as such, a dialogue with your audience and a dialogue with the podcast and the rest of your brand platforms.
For me, it's usually email. It's much easier to get a newsletter subscriber than it is to get a podcast subscriber. And then once they're on my email list, then I can present them with an ongoing feed of episodes that may be interesting to them. And if I start to collect any kind of like segmentation data, then I can, if on my initial sign up form, it says, what's your biggest podcasting challenge right now? Somebody says, I want to get sponsors for my show. Then in a welcome email, I can say, hey, here are 3 episodes, my favorite 3 episodes on getting sponsors for your show. And now this person who's just signed up for my email list, they've got a curated feed of episodes that are highly relevant to them. That makes it much more likely that they are going to listen to the show in the first place, have a positive first impression of the show, and keep coming back. And so for me, email, especially for business, email is really at the core. And so if we're going to be wanting to getting people on email anyways, I feel like it's easier to get people in there and then get them into the podcast after the fact than by trying to promote the podcast, which is probably the hardest thing we can get people to take action on of anything in our content ecosystem as our main kind of promotional focus. All right. And then the second thing, once we have developed our system and our strategy around that, the next step is to look at borrowing and leveraging other people's audiences. And so finding other, brands, creators that have significant overlap or complementary audiences to ours, and then partnering up with them. And this could take many forms, could be promo swaps or feed drops or guesting, lead magnet swaps. There are, near infinite ways to collaborate with other people. Kind of the limits are your creativity, but we can kind of leverage all of those. And this is, if you can do this, this is really the only strategy that you need, in my opinion, is collaborations. And you can build your entire marketing strategy around that forever.
I would not be afraid to re-record some of your questions if you need to. Now, you do get into a thing, we re-record all our questions because we always have to re-record one. Because maybe you asked a question, the guest answered something completely different. And it's genius, right? But the question you asked does not make sense for the answer they gave. So we may have to insert one or more questions, and you do want them to sound somewhat similar. You don't want to sound that all the time, but there are earlier examples on the podcast where you can hear I re-recorded 1 or 2. And the best way to do that is to record it in the same space with the same equipment that you use to record the interview. I also wouldn't be afraid to move your material around. So I told you that sometimes, our guests bring up technical language. So with the task and gain system of slavery, that just came up in a conversation, and the scholar just mentioned like, oh yeah, the task system of slavery, blah, 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 and went on. And then my immediate follow-up was, for those of us who can't quite remember our textbooks, could you explain to us what the task system of slavery was? And in that particular case, what I did was I took her answer and then inserted it in the original answer. So when she said task system of slavery, and then it said something which is, and gave you the definition, and then listeners could follow along with the original answer. And I just cut that extraneous question, that extra question out. And sometimes you just can't because of the way the conversation added, but don't be afraid to ask and leave that follow-up question in to make sure that listeners are really understanding what the guest is trying to convey to them.
And what we wanted to do was see if there's a different economic model that can be used for a rural podcast network. But as we've gotten into it for the past year, we realized that it can be used literally for any distinctive network. So our closest town is San Antonio, Texas, or our closest city, I should say, is San Antonio. So you could use the same model for a San Antonio podcast network. You could, at a podcast movement event, I met a woman who used this model, and it's where I got my idea from. She had one block in Brooklyn that she had a podcast network around, and it was all businesses, but they were consumer-facing business. So can work in a wide variety of geographic models. The prior economic model for a rural podcast network was to have one major or mega podcast, and whatever the topic might be, hunting, fishing, farming, wineries, birding, you name the topic, golfing, and then that would basically pay for the entire network, and you would have more pods built around that. Well, we didn't think we were going to have that sort of national or international podcast out of Kerrville. So what we decided was to try something different. So as Andrew said, we founded this in October 2022. We started with 3 shows. We now have 12, and we have 1,700 subscribers to the network. The significance of that number is there's just over 20,000 people in our hometown. And the newspaper that I'm going to talk about, we have a 3-day-a-week newspaper, has 3,000 subscribers. So we are fully half of what the newspaper is in 1 year in terms of subscribers. This is a list of our podcast network. And I put this here to show you really the breadth and scope. I've said this many times, and I will say it at the end of this presentation. In podcasting, the only thing that you are limited by is your imagination.